All right, we're headed to the office. It's Wednesday morning. I napped a little longer than I was hoping to after CrossFit. I am apparently like super run down, and I didn't really realize, like, so I gotta pay more attention to that, but like definitely noticed. Man, this guy's flying. I remember like leaving CrossFit this morning and being like, yeah, like, you know, not feeling great. I got a nap, like, for sure. But I figured, okay, if I get like nap till 8 a.m., I got an hour of productivity before I leave for the office and stuff. And like, no, I woke up from that nap and I was like, dude, you are nowhere near ready to go here. So, kind of sucks, but I got to listen to my body, right? I've talked about this before from like a productivity perspective. It's like, I don't know, it's I get momentum when I have productivity. Like, it feels good, and then I want to keep doing more. This guy on a bike is ruining this guy's day. The reality is, though, like, that kind of will push me to a point where, like, I'm not paying attention to certain things. Like, I, like, admittedly have a problem with regulating that kind of stuff. So I fully believe right now I'm kind of at a point where I'm just like, you don't have more capacity, and like, I need to listen to my body. So I don't like it, but it's like, it's what it is, man. So yeah, I got nothing done, and I'll explain why that bothers me, okay? So from 5 a.m. when I woke up till 9 a.m., that's a 4-hour period. The only thing that I accomplished in that period, two things, like, I ate a meal, and I went to CrossFit, and that's a 4-hour period. And that really bothers me, because those two things are like, I don't know, like an hour and 15 minutes of stuff. So like, what's going on with the other hours there, right? So anyway, enough of that. I just wanted to explain kind of my state of mind right now. I do feel very rested right now, which is great. So as I'm headed to the office, that's a good feel. Not like, oh man, I'm still like falling asleep, or I'm grumpy because I'm tired. Like, I feel great. So, you know, I should try to remind myself, like, yeah, you didn't get anything done, but you don't feel like a bag of crap right now, and probably gonna have a pretty good day. So silver lining, I guess. Yeah, so I wanted to talk. I have two topics I want to go through today. One was just from perusing LinkedIn. That's going to be more career focused. So I'm going to talk about that one in the afternoon video when I drive home. And unless something comes up at work where I'm like, oh man, this would be a cool thing to like reflect on and talk about. But the other one I wanted to talk about was testing. And I know that probably some people just heard testing and they're like, great, next video. But hear me out, because I think it's kind of interesting. Especially, like, literally, especially if you don't like testing, it's probably helpful. So I wanted to chat through this, and I'm going to start by giving a little bit of background, not too much though, because I don't want to put you to sleep more than you're already being put to sleep by how much I ramble. But the way that the guys that I'm working with on Brand Ghost, the way that we operate in general is like, we do strongly believe in tests. We're not like fanatics about like, oh, 100% test coverage, but we've lived through periods together where like seeing, like, live through the pain of not having tests and like seeing how brittle things are, and then be like, man, we're spending more time just like, you know, you add a feature, you fix one thing, and you break two more, and you're not even moving forward anymore. And that's like a really scary spot to be from like a productivity and a ability to deliver perspective. And when I've talked about like being agile before, like, for us, it's like the focus is about delivering value. So if we are able to deliver value and constantly do it, and we're doing it without a ton of tests or any tests, we will keep doing it. But what happens is that inevitably, even as much as we'd like to be coding things perfectly, like especially for something like Brand Ghost where it's evolving, right? So there's like some core pieces, like the concepts are core, but I'll give you a quick example. The back end for Brand Ghost is pretty complicated in how it can template things. So if you were trying to think about you're a content creator and you want to make a bunch of posts, you might structure them in a similar way. So you might have like, for yourself, you might say, I need to have a hook on my posts, like a one-liner to kind of open it up. Then there's like a core body, and that's going to be something you configure per post. And then you might have like something like a sign-off, right? Where you can say like, follow me here, or you might say like, here's where my newsletter is, or something like that. So you might have something that's kind of consistent. And then you might want to say like, okay, all the hashtags that I have, I also want to place them at the bottom of my content. And don't read into this too much if you don't like hashtags, whatever. My point is that you might want to have your post templated like this. Now, the most simple case of templating is that you just have a one-to-one mapping. There's a body of a post, and you put the text in there. So that's still like templated, but it's just a one-to-one mapping. So our system supports, like especially on the back end, supports basically like macro replacements where you can have text defined by macros, and before we post for you, we'll go do all these replacements. So you can have, this guy's swerving all over the place, holy shit. And now he's behind me. He was like in the left, he was going into oncoming traffic, and now he's behind me. And now he's stopping. Oh my goodness, get me out of here. So our templating in the back end is pretty complicated, but we realized even before like getting too far, like even with one user, we were like, it's the UX for it is way too much. Like it's going to be so hard to explain to people how to use it. Is there value in it? Like I think 100% yes, because like 90% of what I post online follows some type of templating and macro system that's replacing the macros in the template. So I think there's a ton of value in it. I just think that the experience is very complicated. So back to testing though, what's happening because of this is that like the flow of data through our front end to back end is changing, it's evolving, because we're trying to say, okay, wait, like which things should still be configurable, which things are like, there's no macros anymore from the perspective of the front end, so you can't do like in-text replacements. So we're hiding that for now, not a huge deal. The back end is still fully able to support it. So when you think about these boundaries for where these types of things can exist, the back end remained unchanged. And it's like, hey man, if you want to give me stuff that's templated, I will totally do it. And the front end is like, we will just not even provide that type of data to the back end. We won't present it to the user, won't go to the back end. It's like it doesn't exist. So that's fine. It makes it weird when I use Brand Ghost because my stuff is templated. So some things will break for me right now, and that's okay because I have all the tools to do what I need to do without worrying about it. But it's not going to matter for our users, or it shouldn't, which is part of the point here. So we don't have macros anymore. The fields that you need to populate, they are like, we still treat them as like a macro, but it's one-to-one. So there's no special template. The template itself is just literally a one-to-one mapping. So that's cool. But then we have this other like concept of like different types of posts on social media platforms can have additional fields. And one very simple example is like on LinkedIn, when you post what's called a carousel post, it's a PDF, okay? And it makes it look like Instagram where you can swipe through pictures, but it's just a PDF. So LinkedIn's carousel is a document, whereas Instagram's carousel is other media you can swipe through. But regardless, on LinkedIn, when you're dealing with carousels, when you upload a PDF, you can give it a title. So that's like a title field that just like doesn't exist on text posts or image posts. It doesn't exist on Instagram or Facebook. It's like, it's a thing that you can do with LinkedIn for documents. So like the way that we originally had a lot of this stuff was like, if it's a field that can be populated, we will try to find a way to let the user interface let users populate it. But again, going back to like the macros being complicated, this idea of having these other fields was also really complicated. So trim these things out. So what I'm getting at is like, we built this system to have all this functionality, and then very quickly we're trying to trim down people's access to it just because it's too complicated to start. Are we going to put it back? 100% yes. Do we know how we're going to do that yet? Like 10% yes. So we don't know how to do it in an intuitive way, but we already, and I'm not making this up, we like turned it all off and then started onboarding people, and almost right away we had people going, hey, the title for LinkedIn documents is a perfect example. Had someone going, hey, I want to be able to set the title. And we're like, oh man, like we just turned all this stuff off and now they're asking for it. But anyway, the point is that when you do this kind of thing, your code base is changing and evolving, right? And when you have flux in a code base, it's a perfect opportunity for things to get weird and to go wrong. So I talked about this a little bit before, but especially in the back-end code, I started getting frustrated because that's where I spend my time. And I'm like, man, I'm having a lot of stupid bugs, like, that they should just not happen. Like, the kinds of bugs where they're embarrassing, like, I would break SQL queries because I would be missing a comma. Like, what? Come on, man. Like, there's no excuse for it. But at one point, like near the beginning, I turned on functional tests and had like containers that would stand up and stuff. And then we were doing Aspire stuff and that wasn't compatible right away, so I turned them off. But anyway, I reached a point and I was like, nope, I got to turn them on. So fixed up like some very minor stuff that I thought was Aspire related, and it's not even. It's just I broke some other things around the same time in the testing framework. So now we can write tests in the back end, and we can do things like stand up a database. One of the previous vlogs I was talking about was I need to find I really want to try this. I just don't have time. I want to try, I'll explain it very briefly, but when we go to run tests in parallel, they will stand up their own Docker instances. Now, that's good for isolation, but it's really terrible for performance, especially when we get into like thousands of tests and it tries to kick off like 100 Docker containers in parallel. Yes, there are things you can do to limit concurrency. No, they're not consistent between Visual Studio and running them on the command line. It's a total pain in the butt. Limiting concurrency would just solve this problem entirely, but it's just not consistent unless things have changed in like the past year. So anyway, one way that I can limit concurrency or work around this problem actually is like when I'm writing tests, a lot of the time the IDs are randomized. So because they're randomized, there aren't going to be collisions on things. And if I'm really paranoid about, hey, like this scenario, like I need to make sure that I have an empty database, I could, keep it the same way for that test. But otherwise, I want the default behavior to be like, you share the test database, because all of the patterns in the code for tests right now are unique identifiers. You're not going to get collisions. The only things that can get weird are like if you're like, hey, I'm querying this date range, and I only inserted one thing there in my test, but some other tests like inserted 100 other things. Like, you just have to be conscious of that. And again, if you're really paranoid and you need to have the isolation, great, like stand up your own container. But for the majority case, I wanted to share the database instance. When we did this with Meal Coach, we had so many tests. They were super helpful, but the big problem was that it was having performance problems because of what I said. And run the tests in parallel, it would go stand up like literally it would go try to launch like 100 Docker containers on my computer, and I'm like, nope, like my computer would just stop, and then the test wouldn't finish. Like everything would break because the Docker containers are all messed up, and yeah, it's just like then you can't run the tests. Then you go run them sequentially, and now they go take forever because it still has to go do all the work. So anyway, I want to fix that up, but it's like we don't have enough tests where that's an issue yet, so it's more of a curiosity. But now what we're hitting is like some stuff in the front end where like we absolutely need tests on it, and it's not because like someone working in the front end is like bad at coding or anything like that. It's just back to this idea of flux in the code base, and when things are changing that much in terms of like the assumptions we make about data flow and how users are going to interact with things, what types of data can exist, like when those assumptions change, like without tests, it makes it really tricky to know you have the right behavior. So it becomes kind of interesting because, well, we're going to want to get these things hooked up to our build system, which is a whole other conversation. Man, this guy in front of me, we're in the fast lane. This guy in front of me keeps hitting the brakes, but we were going around a corner and I could see there's literally no one in front of him, so I don't know what he's braking for. Hopefully he's exiting here. Yeah, nice. There we go. I feel better. So we have like test containers and XUnit in the back end. I don't know what we're going to be using in the front end. I think before we were using Jest, like J-E-S-T. By the way, we have like a Next.js front end. It's not Blazor or anything like that. For the guys that I'm working with, I think it's just probably find it easier to work in React and stuff, which is totally fine. I can navigate it, but I need to have like the patterns and stuff set up. Like from scratch, I'm garbage with front end stuff, so just I don't spend time doing it. So I don't know what they want to use for front end testing tech. Probably Jest, unless they've come up with something in their travels since then, since meal coach times. And the other thing, I can't remember what it was called. Oh, it's called Pact, like P-A-C-T. We talked about it like early on with Meal Coach, but we never got around to doing it. And I might butcher this explanation, but the idea behind Pact is that we were supposed to be able to have like these functional tests that literally glue our front and back end together, which is pretty cool. So you should be able to, I can't remember exactly how it works, so I don't want to try to explain it and get it wrong. But I will tell you what I think it is, with the disclaimer that it's probably 100% not what I'm saying. So I think that what it had to do was that you can run your tests separately, so you don't run, like, it's not like you run the front end and the back end at the same time and they talk to each other. I think it was more like you run a tool that will basically create the like the JSON payloads and stuff that you'll be sending and receiving and stuff, and that way, as long as you run the tool, it generates those things, and then you have tests on either side. As long as that communication's met, then you're good to go. I think that's what it is. Now, when I run like on Meal Coach, and I'll probably do the same thing shortly for Brand Ghost, I've explained before in different videos and stuff, like I really like unit testing, like really granular stuff with mocks and like treating everything as very isolated systems, because it helps me prove to myself that the code I wrote is doing what I expect. That paradigm I can carry over, and if I have to mock out external systems, I don't use fakes, I don't use stubs, I don't use anything else except mocks for this kind of thing, because I want full control in a test of a third-party system. Because I want to say, like, when I call this thing, what happens if it throws an exception? Like, how am I going to respond to that? If you're trying to use a real thing, like, can you forcefully make it throw an exception and then see how you react to that? Like, probably not. So instead of like just pretending, I'm like, look, I'm gonna have full control over this thing. People will say, oh, well, how do you know you're making the right assumptions about the happy path and stuff? And like, I can't, but I can make a lot of assumptions about when things are gonna break, right? So the time where that really screws you over is if you have something like a third-party system and they change their behavior like over time and they don't announce it, right? So if you have these types of tests and you're mocking them out and you have data that's coming back and it's always been this way for years, and then all of a sudden they make a change and the real system is now, it's not JSON anymore, it's XML, as an example. It's a really bad example, but like the API calls is still the same thing, right? Like, then you get an XML response back and it breaks. Like, that's the kind of scenario that we're not covered by purely from doing that. But then, okay, it breaks, and then you go add a test for it, so whatever. But it's not, I'm trying to say, like, that's how I like covering things, but it's not, I'm not trying to say that it's the best. And especially when we have things like test containers now, I think there are many opportunities to be able to stand up tests, run them quickly, like totally functional tests with more complicated systems, like launch whole Docker containers, right? And it's still fast and repeatable. So I still write code in a way that can be tested and mocked out, just because that's how I write code. And I actually spend more time from a testing perspective on like these higher level, like functional tests, because I find that now with the tools and stuff we have available, I can get a lot more coverage. It's a lot more coarse, right? So if something breaks in the functional test, like, okay, now it's between so many layers and modules of code, but at least it could all get exercised, which is very valuable. And at this stage, and I've talked about this, I've made videos on this on YouTube in more of like a tutorial fashion, where I explained with Meal Coach literally the evolution of how we had to test. And what came up was like the functional test and just offering tons of really coarse coverage was so helpful, because like a lot of code was being exercised, and then along the way, like, there's so many opportunities for things to break over time that it would just happen to, like, you know, by just having a wider net, you would see more things. It meant that when they broke, you'd have to be like, okay, well, what the heck actually broke? But at least you know. So I went on a bit of a tangent there, but some of the tests that I want to start writing with Brand Ghost are literally from calling the web API. So what I've been doing for the most part is, like, so far in Brand Ghost, is doing like a level below that. So forget that I have to make web requests, like whether it's a get or a post or what the JSON payload looks like. That's like a pretty thin layer of Brand Ghost in the backend, at least. And then below that, then we start to have the business logic. So I've been writing like functional tests on that'll exercise that. It will write to the database. It'll read stuff back. So it's still really good coverage, like through the stack. But like, as we start adding and changing features, like what's not getting any coverage right now is at the API level. We've only had a couple of things like this so far where we're like, oh crap, we didn't talk about renaming something or whatever. I got to explain what just happened. So we were merging onto the highway and there was like 6 cars in front of me, and we were probably going 20, and no one was trying to move over in all the other lanes. So I don't want to get stuck behind people like that. Like, it's actually dangerous. You're merging onto a highway, there's no other cars around yet, and you're going like 20, and we're about to approach a bunch of spots where people are merging on. Like, you can't be merging onto a highway at 20 miles an hour. doesn't work. It's not safe. Someone's going to come around a corner flying, and you have 6 cars going 20 miles an hour for no reason. No, I'm not getting stuck behind that. So at the API level for us, like, we haven't had too many issues between the front end and the back end, but I would like to get ahead of that, I think. So what we were able to do with Meal Coach, and I'll do the same with Brand Ghost, is that the functional tests, instead of just having the database stood up, they will literally launch an instance of the back end. So they'll have a back end running, which includes the database, and then they can actually make web requests to it. And that tests like the entire thing top to bottom, which is super cool. To the point where like the calling part has to parse like a JSON response, right? So it's not just you called it and like check the database or something. It's like you called it, you can check the database, you can check the JSON response you get, like you can, it's the full deal. And again, like that's a pretty coarse level test, because you're not going to write like a million assertions on something like that. But it covers a lot of modules, and again, I think that's really powerful. So as I'm coming up to getting off the highway here, I just wanted to kind of maybe summarize some of the like the meta points that I was hoping kind of came through, and I realize, like always, it's all over the place. But code flux, like change in code, the more frequent it is, and this is a very common thing in the beginning of products, especially, right, when they're still maturing and forming and trying to figure out what you're building. That's an opportunity for a lot of code flux, and as a result, a lot of scenarios breaking. I don't think that it's like we should, it's unexpected, like we should probably expect that kind of thing. It's a lot of churn. So that's one thing. The other thing is like finding it, my opinion on this kind of thing is like finding when it makes sense to be writing tests. So I kind of talked earlier about, we were doing pretty good without tests, like adding tons of value without tests and moving fast and like being very productive, right? And so like, should we have added tests? Like maybe, but also I was telling you that we were changing a lot of the actual behavior. So if we would have spent, I'm just making this up, I don't have numbers, just to give you an example, but if we spent twice as long, because we were adding like testing infrastructure and getting these tests and stuff in place, and we delivered half of what we did, and then we just went and turned off half the features in the UI, like that's literally a waste of time. I'm not trying to say tests are bad, please don't hear it that way, but like we would have spent way more time and then actually just turned it off, and no one even would have used it. So it's not even like we helped ourselves. So I think for us, it's about being pragmatic about when we start investing into testing. And I say that again as someone that really values testing. It's just that I also really value shipping value. So I think for us, something that I like to, I say this kind of phrase, and I know it sounds kind of weird, but I'll often say like living through the pain is a good indicator of where you need to be investing into things. So one of the takeaways here is like, as we started to progress with Brand Ghost, like we're living through some of the pain where we're like, man, like why are we having these simple bugs? Like this is so embarrassing. And it's like, yeah, like we're probably at the point now where some things are solidifying and they really need tests on them because they're starting to become core. If they were still in flux and changing rapidly, it would be like a pretty difficult decision to say like how much do we want to invest into that. But some parts are like, it's critical. If it's not working, it's the whole app is busted and useless, right? So I think that's one takeaway. That might be it. Words of wisdom. There's something else I wanted to say about living through the pain. It's unrelated to the testing thing, but I like talking about this because I think it's interesting. But in terms of like automation and stuff, I think sometimes people, like as programmers, we really like to automate things. So like, hey, we did it once, like let's just automate it. But I think until you've kind of struggled with something and you're like, man, this sucks to do. Like, I think it's important to live through a period where you're like, yep, like, I don't know, the way we build things, the way we mitigate incidents, the way we solve and recover services, like all that kind of stuff. Like, yeah, in theory, you want it to be super automatic, but like, what do you even need to automate? It's an open-ended question. I mean, like, if you haven't actually felt the pain of where things are crappy, how do you know how to spend your time effectively? So I like saying, like, hey, look, it's not that we're going to stop, but like, we got to live through it a little bit to understand like why it's crappy, understand where the pain points are. And that also tells us the priority, because if there's 100 things to do to make it better, what was the most painful part? Like, maybe we should start there. If the most painful part is also one of the things that's maybe potentially easier or shorter to go make a fix for, get that covered, get that automated, get that out of the way, right? Like, I think it's a good thing for helping prioritize. Anyway, yeah, I like saying you got to kind of live through some of the pain to find out where to spend the time on things, but hope that was interesting. This afternoon, if I don't come up with a better topic, I am going to be discussing interviews, because my video with Jade Wilson, who was visiting from the UK, she's a Microsoft employee, she's a very big content creator on LinkedIn. We did a little interview about interviews, and super cool. So shout out to her for putting that together. I really enjoyed it. She was helping us and Ryan Murphy, like, promote our course that we just launched. So it was very kind of her. I appreciated it, and I really enjoyed the conversation. So on LinkedIn, Ryan shared the post that Jade had put up, and another fellow content creator that we really like. Actually, like, Ryan and this individual were kind of going back and forth and having a disagreement, which is, I think it's good to have disagreements. And they're not like these types of things. Like, I know these two guys like each other, so I think that's super cool to be able to have a debate like that. And I wanted to kind of chime in on my perspective on it, because I think that some of the wording that was used is conflating things. So I'll talk about that more in the afternoon, unless something totally juicy at work comes up and I'm like, hey, this is a great meta thing to talk about, but we'll see. So I will see you later.